Thank you for coming along. I'm Simon Knight. I'm an academic at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I lead the CREDS Centre for Research on Education in a Digital Society. I'm a visiting scholar in residence here at KTH, and have been here since it was snowing, so since April, and leaving next week, which has been a very lovely trip. And before that, I was at the UCL Knowledge Lab in their Institute of Education, visiting the academics there. And across the last 6 months, the focus of my work has been around this question of learning about ethical AI and learning for ethical AI. And in giving talks like this, there's always this kind of task of trying to bridge the work that I'm doing at the moment to the sorts of issues that people are thinking about on your day-to-day practice and the bigger picture of the research that we're doing. And I've given a few sort of variations on parts of this talk, thinking about the framing for that, whether or not it's about how you, the malevolent audience, might become less unethical in practice, about the way that we interact with our students and try and design assessments, and about the kind of political positioning of research on ethics when we're trying to drive forward technology as well. And today, my assumption is that you are here, we're all here, because we share a kind of practical concern that we do research and we want to do it well, where that refers both to, you know, it being good research methodologically, but also we want to do good with that work. And the question of where can we look for helping us think about that kind of question, what sorts of resources we have available to us. And that's going to be what I'll talk about today, and some of the work that I've been doing over the last 6-7 months. I'll try and flag where that work's been collaborative, but I'm also going to apologize up front to anybody that I do forget along the way. Certainly not because the collaboration isn't appreciated. And so to give some kind of opening framing, when we're thinking about learning how to use AI and learning about the ethics of that, we've got this kind of dual focus. We have both learning about AI, so we sometimes might frame this as algorithmic literacy, but also learning with new AI tools. And my research has primarily been in the space of analysis of learning and education environments. And so that second component has been really crucial to that. And the people that I work with and we are researchers who are passionate about and with expertise to speak to this intersection of learning and technologies. And that contribution, that expertise, plays a really central role in questions about ethical engagement or indeed disengagement with AI. And so for me, we've got two stakes here. One is that we care about learning in AI because learning is one space where applications of technologies, including emerging AI tech, has significant impacts, and where many of the questions that we have are normative in nature. They're about what skills we value, what sorts of ways of interacting with each other are important, and so on. But the second stake that we have here is that the question of ethical engagement with AI is fundamentally a learning problem. And it's a learning problem with respect to that development of algorithmic literacy, which we need to be able to engage with tools ethically, to have informed engagement. It's a learning problem in the way that we can learn from materials that are available, the kinds of cases or incidents that are published in order to help us navigate ethical issues, things like ethics guidelines. And it's a learning problem in a kind of theoretical sense, in that there is an established body of literature around ethical development, around moral development, that we can draw on when we're thinking about this kind of space as well. But whilst thinking about those kinds of connections and the integration between the space of learning about AI and learning with AI, learning about AI ethics and learning with AI ethics, we've seen that there tends to be something of a focus on relatively technically focused approaches. We've also seen that whilst there's been a growth in focus on the ethics of AI, so this is from Google Ngram search. It looks much the same if you do a Google Trends search. Since, what's that, about 2015, we've had this massive spike in interest in AI ethics. There have been 4 recent reviews of AI ethics guideline documents. Those guidelines are from scholarly communities, policy contexts. So the European Commission, European Union published a number of things. Various other kinds of organizations, including companies and third sector advocacy groups. We've had this kind of outpouring of content, often with unclear connections between each other. And that shifting sand, it's made it quite hard to establish where the sort of firm base is, what we can, the foundational issues that we have. About 185 of these guideline documents that are reviewed in those 4 different recent papers. And that makes it very challenging for people who don't have 6 months' time to engage with these things, to engage with them. And so whilst the ethics of AI in education has received some attention, in the latter kind of context, in AI ethics education, we've seen that, yeah, we have this kind of technocentric focus, and that some of the features of learning are not always particularly well considered. So guideline documents where the material, it's not that it's bad at all, but the challenge of engaging with it as somebody who wants to learn about these ethical issues is not met always. And so for me, part of the framing for this work as well has a kind of political bent to it, because I am interested in how these learning features play out in how we can navigate AI ethics. And I'm interested in making sure that the expertise of education, of the learning sciences, is centered in that, where sometimes those disciplines and some of the social science disciplines can be marginalized in these discussions. And so the question, and this is what the rest of the focus of the talk will be about, is what can we turn to in thinking about the resources available for this learning? And I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that we can think about ethics and the kinds of resources that we have available there. And as I said before, some of the work that we've been doing to review those. So We'll go through the idea of ethics as an expression of our values and how we can learn about those values and principles and tensions between them. The ways that we use tools and materials, and ethics as that use, as the enactment. And ethics as embedded in the cultures and organizations that we all work in, and how we can frame it in those terms. So in terms of ethics as an expression of our values, as I said before, it's about 185 distinct documents have been mapped across these 4 recent reviews. And they are from a pretty wide range of sources. I have read, to some degree or other, most of them, and they're quite different in nature. So they range from actually roadmaps for policy through to 1-page, 10-principle kinds of documents. So they're really radically different things. Having looked at them as well, one of the things that's interesting is these are reviews of guideline documents. So the word guideline, you would imagine, would appear in these documents, but actually it is a basic search, so apply some caveats, but just doing some keyword searching over the PDF downloads of them, of the ones that I could obtain, which is about 170. Maybe 10% of them make reference to research or evidence. Now that's interesting because those are fundamental to ethical practice. We need warrants for the claims that we're making about how tools work and what they work for, which we'll come back to in a bit. And a fairly small number actually refer to the term guideline as well. And that speaks to this diversity of aims in those documents. So again, it's not a criticism of the documents because they weren't aiming to be guidelines. But if we are looking for guidelines, then actually the pool of available options might be relatively smaller than the reviews at the moment would suggest. Of the principles that are discussed in them, the 4 reviews all engaged in a synthesis exercise. So very helpfully, I haven't had to do that for this set of documents. And they pulled out the common, both the common principles, but also the set of principles that were covered across all of the documents. And we can see that there is some commonality, which is good news. So things like transparency, privacy, accountability, fairness, non-discrimination, freedom and autonomy, and explainability were common features across all of the 4 reviews as being present in all of the things that they had reviewed. And then across a subset of them, there was some that were sort of relatively narrower. And there were other issues that I would say were much broader. So things like prosperity came in as a principle in some documents. And in education as well, so my own field, there's been this fantastic document from the European Commission recently around the ethical considerations of use of AI technologies in schools and targeting teachers and school leaders in that respect. Again, you can see there are some differences in the principles that they pull out, but there are certainly threads back. One interesting thing is justified choice, which of course speaks to that question of the research and evidence that underpins the tools that we select. So one of the things that I'm interested in looking at value statements and principles like this is they can feel very abstracted. They're very high level. And the challenge of just having a statement of them is understanding, well, what does that mean for the work that we do? It can often be quite hard. And it's when we get into the particular that we start to understand those things. Education is distinctive. We work with, whether it's higher education or school level, populations where there's a power dynamic. We have power over our students in some respect, and that changes some of the ethical questions at play. We're institutions, and there's institutional power and relationships bound up in there as well. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is to map out, well, what is distinctive in the space of education, and thinking about the kinds of uses to which AI is being put in the field. So things like dropout risk, grade prediction, assessment, whether formative or summative, adaptive and personalized learning, and so on. And then thinking about, well, what would the challenges with each of those be? And one of the things that I'd flag is sometimes we have a kind of deterministic attitude towards the use of technology and the kind of march of its intervening into our lives. But it is important to remember, and I think when we get into looking at the particular, it helps us with this, that on a legal level, certainly, regulation does vary internationally. That is a reflection of values in different countries, and it has concrete impact. The gigging economy, I think, is one space where we do see differences. Copyright law is another space, and the intersection of both of those with digital, of course. So thinking about that kind of broad set of challenges that we might face, one thing that we might do is think, if we look at the discourse around AI ethics and the kinds of issues that are expressed in that, do we see this broad expression of the values? And ChatGPT provides a nice recent example, of course, and this is not my work. The reference is at the bottom here. And they reviewed recent coverage of ChatGPT to understand the kinds of things that were being expressed. And what they found was that most of the coverage to date has been around issues of academic integrity. And the corresponding part of that, how we're going to deal with it. So the framing has largely been around students and whether or not they're cheating, although largely with not so much of the student voice in there. I would say, even in the time since this has been published, it's amazing how fast people manage to get things out. Some of this has actually changed, so we are seeing a broadening of discussions. But that would have been certainly my observation from the start of this year, the first quarter. And that's a concern because, again, if we take the particular, if we look at this particular case, there are distinct issues at play when we think about ChatGPT. We've got assurance of assessment. That has two components. One is that we have a validity claim about our assessments, so they're good assessments. And the other is that we have quality assurance in place that does try to prevent cheating, so academic integrity components. But when we're thinking about these tools as well, there are implications for learning that we've seen less reflected at the moment. So things like whether or not you need to learn one skill in order to be able to develop a later skill. Those are questions where we need more research, and to be making claims with very little evidence available, that's an ethical issue. there are also, as I said in the introduction, normative questions about what it's worth knowing. The thing that people often point to is creativity, and that is a normative claim in its own right. But again, those are questions where that discussion needs to happen, and as a society, we need to be able to have those conversations and do that thinking and treat it as a separate question from the assurance question. And that's particularly important because most students don't cheat. If they wanted to, opportunities were rife pre-ChatGPT. Yes, there are things we should be concerned about that are new, but it would be concerning if we start treating all students as though they are out to cheat. And that obviously will have negative consequences. And one of the things that's with my colleague Kirsty Keto, we thought about in this space is how, when we're thinking about the application of principles, we are often trying to balance tensions or competing needs among them. So in the case of integrity, yes, we need to assure the integrity of our assessments, but we also need to assure learning and the autonomy and agency of students in that. And there are tensions there. And what we were trying to do in, this is a blog piece, there was an accompanying BJet article, was reflect our observation of the guidance that we had available as people who were engaged in trying to build tools, was that it was often sets of principles, and principles that the reflection that they did often come into tension, and that there wouldn't be a right answer. Might be better and worse answers, but no right answer, that wasn't in there. And so what we were interested in was trying to understand how can people engage in navigating these tensions, and what kinds of tensions are we experiencing in these principles. And so in a more recent piece with the EdFutures studio at University of Sydney, we looked at the UK exam algorithm, the English and Welsh exam algorithm. Scotland has a different system, and to my shame, I can't remember what Northern Ireland does. Various other countries around the world also adopted some version of an algorithmic moderation in 2020 in the face of COVID, because exams couldn't be sat. England and Wales are a bit distinctive because the exam model means that students apply for university prior to knowing what their results are, and the offers are made on that basis. So they're made on predictions. And what the algorithm did was moderate those predictions on the assumption that teachers are generally more generous than the end results are. This led to protests on the street, with students holding placards saying, "Fuck the algorithm," and "Your algorithm doesn't know me," and unfavorable things about the Minister for Education at that time. But our analysis showed a slightly, well, I suppose I would say this, but a slightly more nuanced picture. So this was the issue that the algorithm was trying to solve initially. That not moderating those grades would mean that there was an unfairness in the 2020 students compared to previous and subsequent years, because the 2020 grades would be higher. And so they used historical data to moderate them down. The consequence and the backlash was that some students had their grades reduced, and that some students had grades reduced by quite a lot, And there certainly was unfairness in some of that. But what happened in the end was they removed the algorithm, and the initial concern, that initial fairness concern, did in fact play out. So in subsequent years, the 2020 students, some of them were asked to defer entry. They were actually paid to defer entry. And in 2021, universities, the nature of the offers that they were making was shifted. So there certainly were differences between what the 2020 and 2021 students experienced. Part of the unfairness that was perceived, and that was the cause of the protest, was also, and again, this is indeed an unfairness, it wasn't an unreasonable claim, that the algorithm was never going to be applied to small testing centers. So that's testing centers where, for an individual subject, a small number of students would be submitting in that exam. And that's because there wasn't enough historic data, and so, well, obvious reasons from there. Turns out, small testing centers, more likely to be private schools. And so there was an injustice present in who was perceived, therefore, to be treated more favorably in that. Most of that kind of level of analysis was not in much of the coverage of that algorithm, nor was the original rationale, which, although the execution was flawed in many ways, and there were other approaches that could have been taken, the rationale that was there was one around fairness. So just focusing on the unfairness that led to the protests provides a really partial picture. I have a note on this slide as well of about algorithmic inference, and there's a fantastic paper by Esan et al. At FACT, I think in 2021, I don't have the date written down, that talks about algorithmic inference because the UK exports its exam system. And those exams are regulated by the same body as they are in the UK, Ofqual. So when Ofqual made the decision to introduce this algorithm and make these changes to the assessments, that had flow-on impacts in other countries. And these authors specifically focus on Bangladesh. And those impacts, they didn't just happen when the algorithm was introduced, they happened afterwards as well. And that's the imprint. That by introducing it and then removing it, systems had already changed. So it wasn't about whether or not the grades that were received were algorithmically mediated. They were effectively algorithmically mediated because there was ever a proposal that this model would be imposed, because different systems of teacher assessment, of sitting for mock exams or practice exams were in place in the schools that they looked at. So again, we have this kind of nuance in looking at the particular places, the particular context, and the application of principles to them. So another way that we can think about ethics is in terms of the way that it's enacted, the materials that we work with, and the way that we work with each other. The principles give us the shared language to talk about our values and try and navigate that. Then cases and other sorts of materials hopefully help us to move between specific examples, like the fairness one, and more general, and then into other cases that we might be working on. And to do all of that, we're using strategies of various kinds. Informed consent forms are a kind of material strategy that we adopt that we're all very familiar with. And those those materials, they encode particular kinds of practices and values. So part of the focus here, and this has actually been largely with colleagues here at KTH and at Stockholm University, so Olga, Cormac and Tessie, we've been looking at cases. And here again, we see we've had this increased attention to AI ethics, but generally, the focus has been on aspects of what we can call procedural ethics and principles over looking at those kinds of practices and the material resources we work with in interaction. And what I would describe as fairly obvious cases of ethical failure have been quite central to that. So the example here is from the president of a US university who, in talking about grades and progression and whether or not we should encourage students to leave, use the expression, you just have to drown the bunnies. And the end of that quote is put a Glock to their head and pull the trigger. This is just an example of a clearly inappropriate thing for a university president to say in any kind of public forum, certainly. And so for me, it's interesting in a sense, but it doesn't do anything to help us navigate ethical questions. And so my radical claim that, shouldn't be so radical is that if we want to learn about ethics, we actually have to talk about ethics. And that means talking about those nuanced principles and thinking about those hard cases where it's not obvious, where it's not a clear-cut, coarse-grain example. And we've done some work that I hope helps towards that. So with colleagues in Australia, Shivani Antoinette and Simon Buckingham, we published a piece this year, I think, around work we'd done developing a writing analytics tool. And the subtitle of the paper at one point was the issues we encounter that didn't make it into the papers. And the point isn't that we hid lots of things or that these were particularly bad things. Some of them are, in a sense, kind of boring, but it's the nuance of it, and that we did talk about some of these issues. So things like, if we're giving writing feedback to students, should we include a spell checker in that? Because if we don't, then we were using a rules-based tool. Things have changed, obviously. The system may not pick up the features that we care about and might not give feedback. But if we do, there's resource cost to that. That's not also distract students, because we don't care about spelling as a feature in itself. We want to focus on higher order features. And so in this paper, what we tried to do was express that, give an example, but also to set out a kind of method that we might be able to put forward that people could adopt or adapt into their own cases as well, to encourage this kind of sharing of design cases with an ethical kind of texture. And doing that, we set out this kind of model where we were looking at the ethical issues that we encountered right at the start, at the inception, and in those initial design stages, into when we evaluated and were developing. We wanted to put a tool in classrooms, and we had no idea, well, that's not true. We were not sure what the efficacy would be. We're asking students to do something, and we don't know if it's going to benefit them. That's clearly an ethical concern. And then once we've done that work, at what point do we step away and hopefully support our colleagues to pick up the tool and implement it by themselves, potentially without our input, and thinking about what could go wrong there, what are the implications of that, how do we support effective use? And that's called safety in the kind of literature. So if we want to look for cases that might help us think about those sorts of issues, where can we look? Well, one possibility is the set of, again, I think these are fantastic resources, databases that we have available that are collecting incidents or acting as observatories in some sense. So two of them are here, the AI Incident Database and the AIAAIC, not my name choice, repository. Both of those collect examples where things have gone wrong effectively. They're incident catalogues. And we've identified 14 of these globally and extracted the structure. So how are they structuring these cases? What's the kind of metadata or schema for those? To try and understand where are the ethical features in the expression of those incidents and cases. So one of the things that's interesting is only one of them explicitly has ethical principles in its kind of structured data. That doesn't mean that the others don't have it anywhere, because sometimes it's in plain text fields kind of implicitly. And some of them do talk about harms, risks, and transparency issues. So those are narrower slices of the kind of ethics space. Being more focused, we've then looked at about 100 cases that are specifically in the field of education. And that's for two reasons. One, we just needed to narrow focus, and two, it's our field. So it seemed to be the field that it made sense to focus on. Not all of the repositories were licensed such that we could use that data or had any education cases. And so obviously those were excluded. So there are about 9 that did. And across those, we can see some commonalities. And one of the things that's interesting here is reflecting back to that table I showed earlier about different uses for AI in education and the issues that we encounter in those uses. And so we see here admissions algorithms and assessment assurance, proctoring generally, feature quite a lot. Facial recognition is being used for attendance and safety, which is often gun safety measures. So most of those uses are in the US. And then things like dropout risk, teacher evaluation, and other forms of quality assurance. So looking at the particular again, this is a relatively narrower set of uses than looking at the fields sort of from a high level would provide. So thinking in a bit more detail about some of the principles and the application to direct uses of AI in education, one of the, I think, the most sort of under-recognized question in thinking about ethics is that merit is what it's called in the Australian research principles. I've started calling it worth. So is this worth doing encodes a normative kind of element to it. And it's an ethical question. So how do we know it works is an ethical question. And it also encourages us, I think, to reflect on what we mean by it works. And sometimes we focus on the things. So we focus on dashboards predictive analytics for risk of dropout, things like that. And this is drawing on an editorial that that was led by Alyssa Wise and I was having a chair when I was a journal editor, and we were reflecting on this in the space of educational technology, particularly and learning analytics, and wondering if we shifted that focus from things to the question of why and looking at aims and evidence there, would that encourage us to look at, instead of dropout, things like struggle and what it means to struggle and why certain students would be, and what kinds of struggle they might be engaged with, and whether or not predictive analytics would be the most appropriate models there, so risk ratings. And this question matters for the wider field. So large language models are the current hot topic, right? They open up a lot of opportunity, but just because they're available, it doesn't mean that we know what the impacts will be. Those three distinct features that I pointed to earlier, there are so many questions there that need evidence around them. There are a large number of edtech tools available, whichever are the numbers you want to take from here. But we know the evidence for them, even ones targeting school education, these numbers are from, is often pretty weak. So the US has an evidence standard called ESSA, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for. The lowest level of the 4 in that standard is that you have effectively a theory of change. So you can explain why you think that the tool will work, and that has some grounding in literature. So you don't have to have done significant empirical work on it. So it's a relatively low standard. Of the 100 most used edtech tools in the K-12 system in the US, only about a quarter of them meet that lowest standard. Again, this is an ethical question, and it points to that issue around worth. And when we talk about worth, that can mean two things. It can mean a thing that's worth doing. So the ends have value. We agree about what the value of this thing is, that issue around values. But it can also mean that it will actually produce the ends that we want. So there's a validity claim in there. And that, I think, helps us, because by breaking things down that way, we can think about, well, if the risk is that we don't know whether this thing's going to produce that outcome, what kinds of strategies can we adopt to try and address that risk? If it's that we think it will work, or it does work, we've got good evidence, but none of the practitioners use it, well, that's a different issue, and we can address that in a different way. But it requires us thinking about the evidence. And part of the work that I've been doing has been around that, and it builds on fairly well-established literature. This is in ed. I know from other fields that there is other literature that would parallel this, flagging that the improvement in technology doesn't necessarily mean improvement in adoption or improvement in outcomes, and that actually a focus on how people use tools, so as Ryan Baker put it, stupid tutoring systems, intelligent humans, it might well bring us further forward. So stop developing the tools or focusing on that as the key thing, the object, and focus on practice instead. And so part of my work has been around developing tools to give feedback on student writing. And this is a space where, again, it's radically changing over the last 6 months. The technology and the use, there's fairly significant gaps between. And that is a concern because there's potentially opportunity costs there. And it seems like an area where writing is important for academic studies, of course, but for success across most careers and life. And I'm not going to go through the tool that we've developed in any great detail, but the focus of it is on these kinds of rhetorical moods that are a hallmark of academic writing, so argumentative writing. And for example, is a rhetorical move. Contrast is another one. So, however, ... etc. And we've done work to try and design a tool that gives feedback on those moods and to tweak it for different disciplines, both in the features that we identify and then how we represent those to students as well, and mapping that to their assessments. And we give it a document level, which is this one, and then on the individual sentences too. And the feedback that we provide, we're always really clear that the feedback is coming from a machine, doesn't understand the writing, and students need to be using their own judgment. And we tried to use it as a formative tool, both for students individually, but also in augmented settings, so peer assessment, actually self-assessment, formal self-assessment models as well, encouraging them to reflect on that feedback. And that's required us working with, a range of different stakeholders, from the academics directly and the tutors. And there's not always alignment between them. And then, of course, students and tech developers and so on. And the model that we've adopted is to try and understand what are the practices that the academics have that are well established in the literature, or for which we've got reasonably good evidence, where the addition of this automated tool might actually support them to improve students' assessments. So thinking about the tasks students are doing and what features we can obtain from the data that would bolster those existing practices. Now that serves two purposes, because it also helps then when others beyond the first academic we work with adopted into other contexts, they're picking up the tool, but they're also picking up practices that are grounded in evidence. And so part of it has been about the work on the kind of individual setting of our research sites, but then also thinking about, alongside developing this technical infrastructure, we built a tool, it's open source, that's a challenge, but also what's the social infrastructure that can go alongside that will actually support people in adopting this tool into practice. And so the final way that I want to reflect on ethics with you is the way in which ethics is embedded. It's embedded in our interactions with things and other actors, where we, in those networks, and that's in, of course, organizational and cultural settings that we work in. And here again, looking at the particular is helpful. So some work again with Cal Golson and colleagues led by the Ed Future Studio at Sydney. We looked at automated essay scoring in Australian schools. Automated essay scoring has been used in America for, I can't remember, a while, decades. It's well established, it's not uncontroversial, but it is well established there. And there were recent discussions about trying to introduce it in the Australian context. And as you might imagine, some backlash to that. And so what we did was bring together different stakeholders in this, it's a technical democracy process, trying to understand what are people's understanding of this problem and what are the challenges that they perceive in this kind of implementation, not as a way of putting a roadmap out, but as a way of trying to map those concerns and support engagement in the problem of the fundamental stakeholders. So we're teachers, union representatives, policymakers, some of the assessment designers, and some tech developers as well as researchers, of course, coming along. And what that work helped us to think about was some of the challenges of things that we wouldn't normally reflect on using the kinds of ethics tools that are available to us. So things like the labor implications of automated essay scoring, where there were and still are concerns around teacher pay already, and many teachers supplement their income through the grading of his assessments. Things like schools in Australia are distributed. We have many regional and remote schools, and they are not the only ones where the technical infrastructure available to implement automated essay scoring, which requires use of a computer to do the assessment, it isn't there. Or if it is, the burden then on the rest of the school would be enormous to a degree that didn't seem to have been considered in some of the earlier initial evaluations of this possible introduction. The full report is available as a white paper, as is the method. So if you want to explore that more, I will make these slides available. But the reflection here is that, again, if we think about the kind of broad set of issues in the particular context of education that might be encountered, the reflection of that into the resources that we have available at the moment, there's often a gap between those. And, you know, that matters because obviously the work that we do takes place in these societal structures, and the learning problems that we focus on, they tell us something then about how the values that we have, the things that we hold in those structures. And this is a reflection of the focus on things versus the question of why. But we can ask the question, what are we reinforcing in the practices that we're adopting, and what are we challenging? And what assumptions are built in about what systems should be maintained versus what things we might either challenge directly or at least leave open to being challenged subsequently. So the last kind of project that I'm going to just flag actually looked at this expression of ethical issues, but instead of looking at it in a particular problem like automated essay scoring, we looked at the research ethics applications at my institution. So this is with colleagues at YES. Applications for the term AI and a bunch of other terms to try and understand what was going through and then to obtain those applications, obviously with consent. So one of the things that was interesting, there were a relatively small number. That perhaps reflects that a lot of work in that space is not going through under the auspices of a human research ethics process. So it's around building tools, but which may be a challenge. And what we were interested in is what kinds of resources people were drawing on, because that tells us something again around the conceptual space that people are working in. So I think there was something like 90 in our initial set. I was on 20 of them, so we excluded those ones. And then a bunch were not relevant. We ended up interviewing 5, and we had the applications for a bigger number. And we tried to understand what kinds of issues were people flagging, but also what resources were they drawing on in navigating that. And this was partly to think about, there've been some calls for new models of research ethics, claims that the existing systems are not adequate. And what we wanted to do was to explore that and to see what people were drawing on. And so you can see some of the things here. And from the interviews and our analysis of the materials, the kind of headlines from this work, which we're drafting for a write-up at the moment, are actually, for the most part, in the applications we saw, the issues that were dealt with appeared to be dealt with adequately by the existing forms and by the national statement on ethics that we have in Australia. The participants said that they actually appreciated the kind of process, the reflexive process that the research ethics model fosters. The thing that they did flag, and again, this comes through in the literature, is concern for cross-sector standards. And that some of the issues were not about the immediate impact on their participants, but reflecting about what the implications of this would be long-term. And so this does appear to be a gap, at least in some research ethics models. And for me, what that speaks to, and participants did say this as well, is the need for practical examples and tools that help people in this kind of reflection and the sharing of cases. The sort of other institutional part of this work, and I'm doing this work with editors on a number of journals in the edtech space, is looking at the sort of outflow from research. So the ethics committee is a gatekeeper at the start, journal editors, gatekeeper at the other side, and trying to understand what are different venues implementing to both have compliance with ethics standards, but also to encourage people to express the ethical concepts that they're working with. And for me, and this is part of the work that we're doing, if we aren't expressing the ethical concepts we work with and our values in our primary mode of communication, where are we doing it? And that matters because we learn from each other through those papers, the journal articles and conference articles. And they're public documents as well, so other people use them. They use them in various forms of practice with open access. You know, hopefully we are increasingly providing engagement pieces that go alongside as well. If we want public trust in science and AI, having that expression in those documents seems crucial to me. But this is just mapping the kind of ethics ecosystem. We have relatively few opportunities through this ecosystem to engage in that kind of reflection and to share it for other people. And so despite the fact that we've got this very wide range of principles, this is from one of the reviews that I flagged earlier, and there are some really great resources that provide toolkits and things like that. So this is from the CSIRO, and it's a pattern catalog for responsible AI. It's great. There's lots of really good resources in it. We don't have a shared language and we don't have shared cases that will help us to engage in kind of nuanced concerns in the research that we're doing. And so to wrap up, I like this guy. I started by saying that we talk about the kind of 3 different ways of thinking about ethics. Ethics is an expression, an act in the world and in organizations, in cultures, with other people, with stuff, with materials. Some of those materials are technologies that we build as well. Cases and guidelines and things like that, those form part of that material. And we're doing some work to try and map that. But as an academic community, we also then need to share those and to engage in that kind of thinking and to talk about ethics. And that's the kind of, I guess, headline claim that if we want to support learning, and including our own, about ethics, then we have to talk about ethics. And that means talking about the concepts that we work with, the issues that we encounter through the work that we do, and our strategies for approaching, not solving. Sometimes we can solve things, but often there's no right answer in context, in the particular context, and with particular communities as well. And so I guess my invitation to people is to think about those questions. So the ethical, the values underpinning your work, where they come into play, where there are tensions, and how we can make that visible, both to our scholarly communities, but also beyond that for wider engagement. So I will wrap up there with some, these are the best 2 AI jokes that I could find. I think they're quite good. The others were terrible though. And some invitations to think about sort of on a broad level, but also in terms of policy and infrastructure questions. Thank you very much.